School funding is up in the air while questions are raised about Governor Rauner's basic knowledge of civics. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the weekly program where we talk about state government politics and how it might just affect your life. Joining me this week on Capitol View is Adam Rife, anchor and reporter for WICS Television in Springfield. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you.
And also Hannah Meisel, reporter for 360 Law in Springfield. Welcome, Hannah.
Glad to be here.
Great. First off, let's talk about this recently concluded special session in Springfield. What got accomplished in this special session?
4 days, right? And they were in for a total of, I didn't have the clock on it, but
Not long.
not long. I think for the first 3 days, they were in and out in about 15 minutes. Part of that coming in, President Cullerton saying we're not going to take action until Monday. They were scheduled to be in Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then Monday of this week. And so we had 2 days at least of not much to do, since he said we're not going to do anything, release this to the governor's desk until Monday. A couple comments were thrown in there, I think, about the governor's mental stability, I think came from President Cullerton. That was one that got a lot of attention. But the bottom line, they didn't release Senate Bill 1 until it was Monday, and we had a couple days to talk again about how many per diems they were earning and how many miles were being reimbursed.
Well, you're keeping the math, Adam. How many per diems were earning? Do we have any sense of what this cost, folks?
I don't have the total on how many people took. Hannah, do you off the top of your head?
I don't. I do know that last week, was it, the governor signed a, no legislature raises.
A freeze.
The freeze on per diem, so they went to the old rate.
But general consensus from, I think, 4 summers ago, when it was pension crunch time, was that session costs about $40,000 a day. Okay. But we had much less attendance for these 4 days of special session.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
All right.
Oh yeah, lots of people didn't come.
And I think one of the factors was for the first special session for the budget negotiations several weeks ago, a lot of lawmakers declined to take those per diems.
Sure.
And I think that was a PR move in many cases. And a lot of them chose to do the same this time around. So not every lawmaker of the 118 were taking their per diems, but still it needs to be said, tens of thousands of dollars were spent for not a lot of work for at least those Thursday and Friday.
Sure. So somewhat a special session for nothing at the end of the day. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I'd say the end of Thursday and Friday. Of course, something did happen on Monday, and as promised, the governor, that bill was delivered to the governor's desk. They released that parliamentary hold.
Sure.
And then I think it was Tuesday officially when the governor came out with his amendatory veto. So that was delivered as promised.
Let's talk about now this amendatory veto of Senate Bill 1. And for those who might not be familiar with it, Senate Bill 1 is a new formula for distributing education funding to districts throughout Illinois, which has long been criticized as having the most unfair, inequitable education funding formula of any state of the union. This bill was designed to address that, and to fix that, the governor has been on record saying, I agree with 90% of it, but. And the part he doesn't accept, apparently, is the money that would be going to Chicago schools, and he says that's reason for vetoing it, and that's exactly what he did. Adam or Hannah, take your pick. How did this veto go down? How was it received?
Well, so the governor, 10 a.m., he did step out into his ceremonial office, and he delivered his amendatory veto message on SB 1. Like you mentioned, the 90% comment, that's been touted by Democrats almost every single day, since actually it wasn't the governor who said it, it was his education secretary, Beth Purvis.
He has not walked it back.
Okay. He's not walked it back, it's true. And I think most people thought that the 10% that he didn't like, either all or the bulk of it, was the sending of $230 million to Chicago public schools to pay for some of their pension costs. CPS, this is a whole nother discussion. They're, as much as the state is in fiscal duress, so is CPS, so is Chicago, so is Cook County. It's not a pretty picture. Anyway, so most people thought that the 10% that the governor didn't like had most or all to do with this pension payment, but on Tuesday he came out with a lot of changes that he suggested with his power of mandatory veto. Things that Democrats claim, are totally new.
Blindsided out of nowhere.
Blindsided out of nowhere.
Right.
And So that's what they claim. Republicans, we haven't heard a lot from them. I'm assuming that some of these, at least, are also new to them. And what Democrats claim, we film on Thursday afternoons. Andy Manar, who is the Senate sponsor of SB1 and for the last 4 years has worked on changing the school funding formula. We just came from a press conference, and he claims that under the governor's suggested changes, schools in Illinois will lose money over 10 years, which would indeed contradict what the governor has long said, that he wants to boost the amount of money that the state spends on schools.
Let me freeze you there for
Sure.
a second, because the governor said at some point there was some controversy about, have you run the numbers on this? What would this mean to various school districts across the state? And he didn't answer directly at a press conference. Then on his website magically appears, I believe it was a day or two ago, here's how much each school district would gain or lose under my preferred plan. Not surprisingly, if you were any place but Chicago, you gained. And so that was up just briefly, and then it went under a password protection, so nobody could see it unless you had the password. Thankfully, some folks sought fit to freeze it or to preserve it so folks can go back and look at it. Why would the governor have done that? Because the numbers look good, I think, for all the school districts outside Chicago. Why would he have made it more difficult to see numbers which actually looked good for every place unless you lived in Chicago?
Well, I believe those were generated by the governor, right?
They were on his
from
website.
His administration. They weren't the official ISB numbers. I think the state board runs numbers, and Senator Brady, leader designee Brady, talked a little bit about this in a press conference last week, I think, where ISB will run the numbers if you request or once a bill is sent to the floor, but there was a little confusion there. But bottom line is those weren't the official numbers coming from the State Board of Education, which apparently seem to be a little different, according to Senator Manar in a Thursday press conference. So not only did the governor not release those numbers, but he also didn't release the changes that he was proposing in the mandatory veto, and that was difficult, I think. Democrats expressed their frustration, and that was part of the reason for the hold, they said, is how can we negotiate when you haven't told us what changes you plan on making? You're going to promise to veto this bill on Monday, the mandatory veto, but you're not telling us what parts you're going to change. How can we address those? How can we work together and talk about it if we don't know what they are? And so when everything came down on Monday, it all came to a head. Democrats talked about being blindsided because this was literally the first time they were hearing of these changes. So,
And there's a whole nother element here before we even get into the exact changes. It's the timing. So an mandatory veto is one of the governor's powers of veto. And in this situation, Democrats have said that they're most likely just going to let it die unless there is an override motion, but it seems pretty implausible. Anyway, now that the clock started Tuesday afternoon when the Senate parliamentarian read it into the record, we have 15 days, so that lands us on August 15th?
Correct.
And some schools open either around that day or even before. School payments are supposed to go out a handful of days before that. And there are, school districts, there aren't many, but they're not an insignificant number, that literally have said they cannot open, their doors without state money. Other school districts have
that
reserves.
said, none have given official notice to the Board of Education they're not going to open.
But anecdotally, media outlets have called around, and it, like I said, it's not a huge number, but it's not
If it's your
insignificant.
kid, it's a huge number.
Of course.
that's a good point.
Right.
You bring up what I think is a really interesting point, because nobody will not be opening, as far as we know, on the first day of school. Now, schools are in bad situations, but as far as we know, it's not a crisis point where they're not going to open their doors on the first day of class. And I think when we talk about pressure points, as we have in the past, pressure points with court mandates, et cetera, I don't think there's a big one anymore for school funding right now, because schools will open on the first day. Now, some may not be able to last very long, but since not every district in Illinois is the same right now, and they're not tied together, I think that one school district or two or a dozen or 25 or so may bleed out occasionally, but as long as other schools are going strong, it's not going to be a statewide crisis yet. So I think it'll be interesting to see. As you mentioned, 15 days gets to the 15th or the 16th, and it depends on the day. We'll double check later. But the 15th or the 16th, if no action is taken, of course, that bill dies, and they start over from scratch. And so the clock is ticking, as you mentioned, but as long as schools are okay, and we're not seeing kids staying home, I don't know that there's any immediacy right now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to me it seems at least perhaps ironic in that Chicago public schools, which in the governor's mind is a sticking point, they got more cushion than some of these other school districts that, you know, are downstate and have Republican representation in the legislature. I mean, how does that affect the political dynamic here? I mean, if I'm a GOP legislator and I've got schools in my district that aren't opening, it doesn't look very good, does it?
No, I mean, I think, like I said before, we knew what was exactly in the mandatory veto. GOP representatives, senators weren't planning on going against the governor, but now that we know the changes are, way beyond removing the $230 million payment to CPS, it's possible. Although I don't see it happening in a dramatic fashion like the override on the budget, where 15 Republicans joined in with the governor, but I don't know. We'll see.
Okay, fair enough. Before we leave this, I think it's important to state, as we teased, there's a question here about the governor's knowledge of basic civics when it comes to passing legislation and governing. Either one. I mean, well, I'll just go ahead and say it. He was at a press conference, and as everybody pretty much knows, it takes a 3/5 majority vote to either sustain or to override a mandatory veto. And the governor insisted, to hold me up, you just need a simple majority. And reporters gave him a chance, saying, it's really 3/5, and he said, no, it's a simple majority. And then he went back to, well, what we really need is fair and equitable funding, and kind of did an end to run. How surprising was that, and what are we to make of that, Adam?
I think it was not just a slip up, not just a gaffe. It's not just embarrassing. It has real consequences, because there's a major difference between 50% plus one and getting that supermajority from the 60 votes, getting it up to 71. And so it's not just an embarrassing moment at a press conference. There's a chance that it's not going to happen, because when this passed first time around, they didn't pass it with a supermajority. As you mentioned, not many Republicans coming across as they did for the budget bill. So this is going to be a major issue, I think, with all the language that the governor inserted with the mandatory veto, all the work that was done. We're essentially looking at something that is probably going to die. At least it looks like it will at this point, unless they get some major progress in the next 10 days or so. And then, as we said, they're starting over from scratch. So we've talked about this at length in all our different mediums. A lot of people coming in from outside government. This doesn't look good when you're essentially unveiling a new staff on one of the first major pieces of legislation, one of the first major actions you're taking with them. And here you are making that mistake as far as the constitutionality of what you're about to sign. So I think it was a big problem.
The question is if he built his whole strategy on thinking
exactly.
if it was a simple majority. I also do want to mention that during these 15 days, lawmakers aren't sitting on their thumbs. The 8 key bipartisan negotiators are still working on compromise. Again, don't know if that will materialize into a brand new bill that the governor will magically like, but they are still working on it.
And important to note, Senator Menard saying in that press conference that you just came from, there were no discussions whatsoever of a bridge bill or a stopgap or anything to get them through whatever crisis time there may be for the schools in the future. There's no bridge bill in the works that will buy them time, essentially. And so it's either SB1 or back to the drawing board at this point. Yeah.
So, I mean, it's possible, that nobody knows, that the governor didn't know, or his staff know enough about government to know how many votes it would take. That's startling, I guess. And anybody who saw that press conference, the governor's eyes got sort of wide. I mean, deer in the headlights is what's been described as. Is that something that could be transferred into a political campaign come next year?
I'm sure it's already in the works in a couple ads that are going to run either on the radio or in the papers or on TV. I think that's a big problem because you may think if you're on the governor's side on this one, you may think, well, he's going to issue that amendatory veto no matter what, no matter how many votes it would take to approve it.
Sure.
But you have to think if his strategy was we just need to flip X amount of Democrats to get this thing approved, all of a sudden that number jumps with the supermajority.
Sure.
So that's the issue right here. It's not that he would have done this no matter what. It's I need how many Democrats now to back me to approve this? That's going to be the issue.
Okay. And again, it's a case of if you choose not to decide, you've made a choice here, because if the bill dies, then there's no funding that can be released under the budget.
Right.
Who wears that jacket?
I think our silence is telling, because there's been blame to go around for the past 3 years. It's difficult to assign less blame to anybody when it comes to the crisis that our state is going through. I think everybody has an equal share on all parties. It's difficult to single anybody out. But the governor taking a firm stand, if you know whether he said it or not, issuing that amendatory veto is essentially saying we're not going to have school funding until you come back with something different.
Okay. And of course, the other option is, okay, let's let bygones be bygones. Let's sit down and write a new bill. How much inertia or momentum might there be for that sort of a solution?
Well, like I said, they are these 8 key negotiators are working on that, and it's possible, like I said, that a new bill would come out of it. But Democrats, Andy Menard today said there aren't a ton of things that he would be willing to take from the amendatory veto. The governor suggested new language that he would want to bring into negotiations. Senator Jason Barrickman, who is basically Menard's counterpart on education funding and has been for years now, he yesterday on Chicago Public Radio said that, it's Democrats who have repeatedly moved the goalpost. If they would tell us that they would be willing to give us this in exchange for us Republicans being able to give you the pension payment for CPS, then yes, we could come to some sort of agreement. But they're still pretty far apart on that, it seems.
Yeah. Moving goalposts, I mean, stuff that the Democrats say they've never heard of that comes up with the amendatory veto. Who's moving what?
We've heard that phrase for years now, all throughout the Runner administration from Democrats. When you look at his amendatory veto statement, the official letter, 8 changes he proposed, 8 major changes, and then you get into the language that entails all of those changes. But the majority, as Hannah mentioned, having to do with Chicago pensions, having to do with the block grant, having to do with a lot of issues out of the city of Chicago. So you may think, okay, hopefully they're behind closed doors negotiating on those 8 key changes and can come to some agreement. But I think it's just difficult. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. This is a philosophy issue. It's a problem with philosophy. It's not a problem of making the numbers work at this stage, as it really has been for the past several years.
I mean, I'm kind of a mind, editorially speaking, that the schools will open on time. They don't dare do this.
Sure.
They're just too risk averse to having, the blame pinned, to risk having the blame pinned on them. And so, am I right or wrong? I mean, it's some way at the end of the tunnel. I mean, we might not know the path, but what are the odds? I mean, they're not going to come up with something.
Well, didn't we say that about 24 months ago when they blew through the first budget deadline on May 31st of 2015? And I don't know. It's hard to say. Of course, something will happen right now. It's difficult.
And then Fitch's comes out with these ratings saying, hey, if this stuff keeps going on, then the credit ratings of school districts are going to be adversely affected. Is that going to ring any bells? Is that going to move the meter anywhere?
Well, the credit ratings agencies had some mercy a couple of weeks back after the dust had settled from overriding the governor's veto of the budget, and they didn't move the state into, to junk status like they had promised that they would if nothing happened. Individual school districts,
of which there are hundreds.
Some, there are many variations throughout the state of what school district's credit rating might be. I think it's harder to understand too, just to a voter, if you want to talk about political ramifications. But, to your average voter, if, the town, even if it's just a couple towns away, you just might say, or whatever. But
What
If they
cut
don't
football?
open or if they close.
right. But
Yeah.
I mean, it is a big deal because
Sure.
climbing out from that is much harder than being downgraded. Much harder.
All right. Let's move on for a second, if we could, just briefly, perhaps. Democrat Day canceled at the state fair. Does that mean Democrats are out of fashion, or are they just keeping their powder dry?
In Illinois? Well, the rally was canceled. The rally that's traditionally held on the governor's or on the director's lawn. Thank you, has been canceled. So the rally is canceled. The political speeches won't be made at the state fair.
They do still get free tickets, do they not?
I think they do, and they
Okay.
can go and enjoy the fair, and we hope they do here in Springfield. We'll take all the revenue we can get, and the State Fair Association would enjoy it as well. But the traditional rally on the lawn has been canceled. They do have earlier in the day at the hotel. They'll have all the speeches, all of those, but. Speaker Madigan spokesperson Steve Brown saying that there's a lot of redundancies. We're essentially repeating these speeches to the same audience, and so for that reason, we're going to stay out of the sun. And I'm paraphrasing, putting words in
enough.
Steve Malpa's.
It is hot. It's so hot, you guys.
We've all been there for hours, and we're hearing from every candidate and every office holder, and so I can see where he's coming from, but it's I don't know that it has major political ramifications.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, might this be kind of a trend? I mean, what happens if the GOP says, you know what, we don't have to do this either?
The governor not wanting to speak to the media or to issue statements?
I'm not sure the
I
governor
can't think
enjoys
of it.
speaking to the media.
I can't believe you, Bruce.
Okay, and let's also talk about here, well, while we got time, it's been a while since we've spoken of the former congressman from Peoria, Aaron Schock. He's been in the news today, moving on to or this week at least, moving on to the federal level. Hannah, what is going on with the former Congressman Aaron Schock?
Well, if we remember, Aaron Schock resigned from Congress in March of 2015, a couple weeks after the Washington Post and other media outlets reported on his $40,000 renovation of his Washington office in the style of PBS, public media, drama,
No
Downton
offense,
Abbey.
it kind of looks like your blouse a little bit. Or did.
Sure.
Good, that's an expensive blouse. That's a compliment.
I'm not sure if it's
$40,000.
It was red. It was red. Is his office is the point, and he had like chandeliers, so like my
Fair enough.
Anyway,
You got Aaron Schock chandeliers.
I
Terrific.
guess so. There's an investigation into this. Not till November of last year, 2016, he was indicted by a grand jury. He's pleaded not guilty. And since late March, he has filed, I believe it's about a dozen motions to dismiss his case, certain counts of the case. He's poked holes in the prosecution's methods. There is a staffer turned an informant that he maintains that was an illegal use by the Department of Justice. A bunch of other things. They're kind of complicated to understand that.
Essentially every trick in the book, right? I
Right.
mean, they're trying to dismiss this or delay it or move it.
Right.
That's happened.
But this week,
Hold on, just a second, if I
sure.
could. I mean, a staffer turned informant. Typically, when someone turns informant, that often means I'm saving my own to get yours, because otherwise I'm going to be in trouble. Is there any evidence or any inkling that somebody is they're trying to help them catch a larger fish to avoid being ensnared in the net themselves?
well, I mean, that is a common narrative, and there has been mentions of that, but I don't want to speak to something that I, don't know a ton about that specific allegation.
Well, speaking of fish, let's go on to Mr. Bass.
Well, this week,
done.
Timothy Bass is the one of the prosecutors.
The lead prosecutor.
The lead prosecutor, investigating this case. And this week, 4 motions to dismiss, and the big kahuna of them was about 88 pages, alleging prosecutorial misconduct, which is a pretty big allegation. It's pretty rare. The Schock's attorneys, some of them are former federal prosecutors themselves, and they said, oh, we can't believe the behavior of Mr. Bass and Co. Because they allegedly delved into Aaron Schock's sexuality, and
Dun, dun, dun.
in the motion, it said it's been whispered about for years whether or not Aaron Schock is gay, and
But what does that have to do with anything?
exactly, it was their point, and they cited a bunch of times in front of the grand jury, witnesses, and one of their main arguments is that just the mention of someone's sexuality and questioning it can impugn, one, his character, but also hurt his chances in front of a grand jury.
All right. And so, I mean, here you got Tim Bass. I mean, he's been a long-time prosecutor, known amongst the local bar as being tenacious and relentless and very, very detailed-oriented. And he has said nothing about this because he can't. I mean, his hands are somewhat tied. They say the standard line is, we can neither confirm nor deny the sun will rise tomorrow. I mean, they just don't comment on cases that are under prosecution. And so what's the next step here? I mean, do you have the case has already been moved out of Springfield. It's now in the hands of Judge Colin Bruce in Champaign or Urbana. Any sense about which way this guy's going to lean in terms of making a ruling on this?
Judge Bruce has denied some of Aaron Schock's minor requests, but he hasn't made any major adjustments in the 12 motions that have been filed since March.
Okay.
But the more that comes,
got a lot of deciding to do.
He does have a lot of deciding to do. The trial, which was supposed to be happening or wrapping up about now, was moved to January.
Okay, and good luck with that one. Moving right along to Jesse White. Will he or won't he? He has announced that he will say something on the 17th of this month. He's run 5 terms, served 5 terms. This would be his 6th term as Secretary of State. He said last time around this will be his last. Is he going to pull a Shimkus on us? What do you think, Adam?
I think maybe he's just trying to save money on stationery. Let's keep his name on everything for 4 more years. It'd be hard to see anybody topping him if he did run again, but I believe he's 76 years old.
83.
83 years old. Okay, well, there you go.
He has the body of a 76-year-old.
Maybe that's what it was. So he's 83 years old. Thank you for correcting me. It's just a matter of if he wants to, because I think no one, certainly the Democrats, wouldn't have a problem if he decided to run again. I don't know that the Republicans would have a strong candidate to top him or at least run against him right now, but they'd certainly be able to find somebody. I don't think anyone would hold his feet to the fire saying, you said you weren't going to run, you can't go back on that. That was a commitment. I think they'd welcome him back into the race.
Okay, and with that, we're going to have to wrap it up for this week on Capitol View. Thanks for joining us.